My guest today is a remarkable man. He's a journalist, a writer, business guru, motivational speaker. Some people call him a sort of a rock star journalist. Malcolm Gladwell, welcome.
Thank you.
Your latest book is
I'm still mulling over rock star.
Rock star journalist. Well,
this is some people, you said some people call me that. I've never heard that before. It's fantastic.
Really? Oh, I've heard that lots in sort of in articles about you. But I mean, it's because you've got a following. You've got sort of a cult following. People come and see you in theatres.
Anything that puts me in the same category as Mick Jagger is a good idea, as far as I can tell.
What drives you as a journalist or as a writer?
What drives me? Well, I like.
Why are you still doing it, in other words? Because you don't need to, do you?
Well, what would I do otherwise? I would be bored. I mean, I like discovering things. And what happens is I keep going back and discovering that what I thought 5 years ago isn't right? It's incomplete, that we've learned way more, that now we're smarter. And so that constant, that idea that part of what it means to be human in the world and a thinking person is to constantly be correcting your beliefs is, to me, fascinating and addictive. I mean, it's like, oh, you mean we've learned way more, now I have to go back and redo it? It's that, but to me, that's like, I love that idea that it makes thinking an adventure, right? If everything was settled, then what would be the point? But the idea that I have a job that requires me to go back and essentially keep readjusting the way I see things is, to me, it's catnip.
Because do you think books should come with a disclaimer? Everything in this book is probably going to be a little bit wrong, and I'm going to think something different in 5 years. So don't treat me as a guru.
No, this conversation should come with a disclaimer. I mean, I think if we had that spirit, if all of us shared in that spirit, we would have a lot less division in the world. It should be okay. Like, I'm going to use, because I'm in England and because all you English do is talk about Brexit, I'm going to use a Brexit example. What if Boris Johnson were to stand up a week from now and say, I had a long conversation with someone who studied closely the economic consequences of Brexit, and I realized probably not a good idea to do it by October 31st, if we do it at all. One response would be like, you hypocrite. Another response would be, you know what? Everyone should be able to do that. If someone convinces you that you're wrong, you ought to be able to stand up and say, you know what, that person convinced me I'm wrong, I'm changing course. And we should be fine with that.
But we seem less able to do that now, do you think? Or is that just a constant?
It's as opposed that people changing their minds publicly is used as an occasion for ridicule and not as an occasion for applause. It should be an occasion for applause. Good for you, we should say.
Although we actually have leaders now who completely contradict what they've said in the past. Call it a lie, call it a change of heart, whatever it is. I mean, what they say 1 minute often bears very little relationship
but you have to own up to it.
Another.
You can't pretend you're not contradicting yourself. You have to say, I used to believe X, I no longer believe it, and then give your reasons. I think it's really crucial to kind of walk through how you came to change your mind. That's the instructive part. What you can't do is say, if I were to say to you, no, when I wrote about crime 20 years ago, I haven't changed. It's like everything I said back then, I wouldn't. I could get all upset about you and just deny it. And some portion of people would believe my denials, but that's dishonest. I think we have to be honest about how our views of the world evolve.
And I suppose that involves a sort of a responsibility on everybody, in journalism as well, not to ridicule.
Yeah. But I mean, you also have to have, it takes a certain amount of, a world in which we follow the facts as opposed to our preconceptions does require a kind of strong stomach.
But we're not in a world that follows facts at the moment, are we? I mean, I suppose this is what I mean, in terms of what drives you. I mean, that sort of, are you in a pursuit for truth in a world in which truth doesn't really matter anymore?
I think, that's funny. I think truth does matter. I think we have a small group of badly behaved leaders around the world at the moment who have kind of distracted us from the fact that, if you were to sit down with, if I was the, head of business development for Dyson vacuum cleaning company or whatever, some other big British company, and you walk me through why I made the decisions I made, everything I did would be fact-based. I would have more data. I would have done more analysis than any other previous generation of British business owner. If you would sit down with a high school principal from the closest high school we can find to this office, and ask that person, why does she do this, this, and this? She would give you reasons that were not, oh, I felt that way this morning. She would say, no, I've studied this, or I saw, we could pick 100 different professions of serious professions, cognitively based, driven professions, and ask them how they make decisions, and they would tell you that facts matter. It is only in this realm of politics and public discourse where we have thought we think we're in a fact-free world. The rest of the world is totally fact-driven. I had a encounter recently with Donald Trump's Secretary of the Air Force. She's a member of her name was Heather Wilson, a member of the Trump administration. I was at some meeting and she spoke. She's got nothing in common with him. She had now left, actually, the position, but she's not a blustery, racist, know-nothing. No, this is a woman who's like one of the most impressive, articulate women you will ever meet, who thinks about everything she says, who has chapter and verse who will systematically make you the argument for why she wants to do what she do based on careful analysis. I mean, so like even within the administration, the problem is we don't talk to Heather Wilson. We just only talk to Donald Trump and a handful of people at the top. But if you take the time to talk to people who are actually making policy, you realize, oh, no. Facts matter in that world.
I mean, is this partly why you sort of seem to avoid politics as an area to write about?
Yeah. I mean, if all you do is think about it, it's just depressing. And it's, with some exceptions, 1939, 2017, it's not the central fact in people's lives. People's lives are about much more than that.
Because what you have sort of cracked as a writer is trust. I mean, you have detractors, but people don't say you're a fake or a liar or anything like that. So people trust you largely.
Yes, I suppose so, yeah.
So, I mean, how have you done that?
Have I done that? Is it my charming personality, do you think? Is it the fact that I'm a Canadian? Canadians are, if you can say you're a Canadian and wave your Canadian passport, first of all, you just get a huge amount of credit from the world. I'm saying that only half facetiously. I think it's kind of true. It's like being Swedish, like whoever says to a Swede, I think you're making it up, or I think you're trying to trick me. No, we believe the Swedes. No, but more than that is, I think that I come from a journalistic tradition where the institutions that I worked for over a long period of time earned the trust of the people, of their readers, and that spilled over onto me. So I worked for the New Yorker magazine for many years, and before that, one of the most prestigious newspapers in the world, the Washington Post, and I benefited from that association. Just as, if you work for, you can name, every country has a group of institutions that have won that kind of respect from the general public. And I think that's a crucial thing, that there is a journalistic tradition that exists in free society that over hundreds of years has rightfully been placed on a pedestal and earned the respect of the general population. And that's a very crucial thing to defend. But I still believe in that kind of power, and I think it has had enormous benefits.
Do you believe in impartiality when it comes to journalism?
No, well, it's too strong a word. I believe in the difference. I think that everyone has a point of view that it is impossible to erase. So when I think about what impartiality means, I simply mean that are you fair in the way that you consider evidence? Are you willing to step outside of your own particular world and engage with other worlds? Are you willing to give those who you disagree with at least a hearing when I was in the world of newspapers, it was, if you're writing a story, even if it's clear the other side is, off their rocker, you got to call them. Because there's a chance, actually, they're not off their rocker. Or even if they are, you have to have the person off their rocker in the story. You can't just go ahead. That's what when I talk about impartiality, that's what I would mean, that you take care to make sure that what you do observes certain standards of fairness. But I don't think you can ever pretend that you are without opinion or without point of view.
Because in a world in which the traditional, respected media, whether it's the Washington Post or the BBC or Channel 4, or whoever it might be, are under attack and undermined for their fairness and accused of being unfair. I mean, do you see a wrong road that they've gone down, that has got them here? Is there some correction that is needed?
Yeah, this is a dumb example, but I don't think journalists for newspapers should tweet. I don't think it's useful. It's fine. I know you have a point of view. I know in America, if you're a journalist, you're probably a Democrat. I know you probably don't like Donald Trump, with the exception of people who work for Fox News. But I don't need to be reminded of that. You need to tell the world that. You should keep it under wraps a little bit. You should at least formally proceed as if you are trying very hard to be in the middle on this. And I think you should try harder to dwell on the subject of tweets, for example. In America, an enormous amount of journalistic attention is devoted to Donald Trump's tweets. I think it would be very useful not to write about his tweets for a while, for all parties. It's not policy. The tweet is not policy. The man is waking up at 3 a.m. and he's like your grumpy grandfather who wakes up really early and starts kind of yelling at the TV. It so happens that when he yells at the TV, he simultaneously tweets and reaches 20 million people. If my grumpy grandfather did that, I would ignore it, right? It's no different now. There's no reason to make that the lead story every day in the newspaper.
Except he is the president and his tweets seem to make a difference because they are to do with international diplomacy.
But all of us, I think, are kind of, we're making a bad problem worse.
So do you think if we just sort of ignored him, for example, on the squad, the 4 Democrat congresswomen, and just ignored the tweets, that problem wouldn't be amplified and wouldn't therefore exist?
Yeah, I'd rather, if we ignored it, I think we could have a much more thoughtful conversation about serious issues. I just think it's a distraction. He knows it's a distraction and he plays it up.
That's why he's doing it probably.
He does it to distract from serious conversation there was this thing this spring with and going on right now, with the absolutely horrific way in which refugees, migrants are being treated at the border in the United States, held in camps under the most appalling of conditions. That story kind of pops up every now and again, but in a normal democracy, that would be a scandal that wouldn't go away, right? We're separating children from their parents, putting them in cages, giving them inadequate food and water, no beds to sleep on. I mean, this is like something that's out of the 19th century. I mean, it's just incredible this is happening. But what happens is it's sort of in the news for 2 days, and then we pay attention to some outrageous tweet, and it goes away. Like that's the real consequences, in other words, from people in the world of journalism from being distracted from their mission, which is to focus on matters of consequence. And when entirely innocent people who are under enormous emotional and physical distress are being treated like animals by the richest, most comfortable, most powerful country on earth, that is the kind of thing I would like to spend more than 48 hours on. And when the president sleepily tweets at 3 a.m. something outrageous, that is something I would like to say, you know what? Let's not worry about it. Let's focus on someone who's actually in pain.
Well, tell us about this new book. What's the jumping off point?
Talking to Strangers is a book that I had gotten interested in this general question of why human beings are so easily deceived. because you would think we would be good at it, at telling when someone's lying to us. That over time, evolution would have selected people who had that skill. But in fact, evolution didn't select people who had that skill, and we're as gullible today as we ever were, right? There was a famous case in America, which you've probably heard of over here, a woman named Sandra Bland, and it was one of those series of high-profile confrontations between police officers and African Americans. And she's pulled over by him on a small town in Texas after she's come from a job interview on the most flimsiest of pretexts. They have a conversation. It escalates into a disagreement. He drags her out of the car, arrests her, puts her in prison, and then she hangs herself 3 days later. And the whole conversation they have is taped by he's a video camera on his dashboard. And it's if you read the tape or watch the videotape for the first time, it is heartbreaking. And I couldn't get it out of my head. And I realized that the thing I'd been mulling over, this problem of why when you talk to a spy do you not realize that the spy is a spy, was part of this larger puzzle of why is it we have such difficulty when we encounter strangers in discerning their motives? Because that's the conversation between Sandra Bland and the police officer is about the police officer completely misunderstanding who she is and her motivations and intentions. I mean, epically, he's trying to, but he reads her emotional distress, and she is an emotionally unstable woman who is very unhappy about being pulled over for no reason. He reads that as evidence of criminality and malice. He thinks she's dangerous. Right now, the difference between being distressed and dangerous is enormous, right? The question is, why would a police officer who is reasonably, his job is to read people's intentions. And here he is, it's a sunny day by the side of the road, and nothing bad's going on. No one's shooting at him, and he encounters this woman, and he epically misreads her. And so I thought, that's where I began to think it would be really interesting to write a book about this general problem of when two strangers encounter each other, why do they get each other wrong so often? And then that's how you get a book called Talking to Strangers.
And in your way, you go into detail and you challenge many of the assumptions that many of us would make about a case like that we might say, well, he just misread her, it was his fault. And you examine whether actually it was to do with his training, whether it was to do with the nature of him being a police officer, what was going on in her head. I mean, do you think there are sorts of bigger truths that we can discern from these sorts of stories?
Yes.
Or are they just interesting?
No, they're the best kind of story is the story that is at once highly individualized and idiosyncratic and general and kind of something from which you could discern broader. So this is a story like that. It's in its specifics, it's like weird and unusual, and it didn't happen a lot, that things like this. On the other hand, it is the kinds of mistakes that police officer was making are the kinds of mistakes that we all make. That was why I was so drawn to this story. And the bulk of the book is each chapter is devoted to a different kind of misunderstanding. And I have a chapter on the Amanda Knox case, on Bernie Madoff, the famous Wall Street Ponzi schemer, the numerous famous spy case, a sexual assault case, famous notorious one at Stanford University. And the argument is, in all of these seemingly disparate stories, there are these similar threads of reasons why, systemic reasons why we find it so hard to make sense of someone who is unfamiliar to us.
I mean, in that case that you sort of built the book around, it obviously comes in the context of Black Lives Matter, of many black people being shot by police officers. And, in Brian Encinia's case,
that's the police officer.
That's the police officer. You examine the extent to which I suppose he's sort of a victim of his upbringing, is his training.
Yes.
Are you challenging us to think that, the instinct to say racist cops is wrong?
Not wrong, incomplete. So does it matter? A really interesting counterfactual is, if Sandra Bland had been white, could the incident have unfolded the way it did? And the answer is yes, but probably it's hard to separate race from this issue. I think it's probably clear on some fundamental level that his reactions to her were conditioned in part by the fact that he's white and she's black. That being said, one of the things I do in the book is I get his police record, looked at the records of every single traffic stop that he had made, every single encounter he'd had with a civilian over the entire span of his life on the Texas Highway Patrol. And this is a man who stopped, so many people, more people than you can count.
It comes over as crazy.
He was the most kind of proactive, the nice word is proactive police officer, which, by the way, is the way police officers are today trained to be. 30 years ago, a police officer was someone who responded to crime. Now we have the new 21st century model of policing is the police officer is someone who, at every occasion possible, gets out of his or her car and confronts and encounters and interacts with civilians looking for evidence of some incipient criminality. He's part of that later tradition. So he's trained to stop everyone. And actually he says, there's a moment in his deposition afterwards where he's asked this point blank, did you react to Sandra Bland the way you did because she's black? And he said, no, we stop everyone. And I sort of think, that's probably true. It's probably the most honest thing he ever said. They did stop everyone. Contemporary cops stop everyone. That's the problem. They do happen to single out poor people, people of color, minorities. But the problem is, in some sense, broader than that. It's that they have a philosophy of policing that's asking them to cast their net over not just people who are very likely to be engaged in criminal activity, but basically everyone who strikes them as being somewhat odd.
And assume that they might be criminal.
Yeah.
And that there might be something terrible going on in their lives.
But that's sort of where the book ends in a kind of very, in an examination of the ideas that are driving contemporary law enforcement and how they're flawed. But the road to that is, I don't want to make this sound like a book about cops, because it's a book about many other different interesting facets of this problem.
But policing is something that you're famously linked to as well. In that in the past you've examined broken windows policing. Yeah. Which was, I suppose, made famous in New York under Bill Bratton, which was this sort of method of policing everything, of policing the broken window, literally. That obviously has sort of, there's been a sort of an arc of that story, hasn't there, of people believing it was real, and that was a successful method of policing, to it now being discredited. Where are you on that?
Yeah,
line?
Discredited is maybe too strong a word. I think now we understand what is useful and what is not useful about that kind of policing. So there is an accurate statement, which is at the heart of broken windows policing was the idea that there is a symbolic component to crime, that when there is litter on the ground and graffiti on the walls and people engaging in very sort of obvious infractions of decorum, it sends a message that no one's in charge, and larger crimes are more likely. That idea is not wrong. That idea has been confirmed in a number of places. It's why we pick up the litter on the subway or on the streets. We don't do that just for aesthetic reasons. We do that because we understand that it's important to signal that a urban area is under control and that people care about their environment. The downside of broken windows was that broken windows encouraged police officers to engage in interactions with innocent civilians without heed to the consequences of harassment. That when a young black man can't walk down the street without having the police suspecting over and over again that he's up to no good, what happens then is the faith, the belief of that young man in the legitimacy of the system is profoundly eroded. And that is very serious, right? And it's that piece of it that I don't think we understood in the 90s, that you can do this. You can send your cops out to enforce, order on a kind of very, very specific, but you will pay a price. And the price is not trivial.
Because in Britain, we're coming back round on the circle on stop and search, as it's known here, where we had very high rates of stop and search. Then people said this is clearly racist and counterproductive, so it was cut. We've now seen a big rise in violent crime, and so stop and search seems to be the obvious way politicians are looking to combat this.
Yeah.
They should be careful.
Yeah. So, there's an argument I make in the book, at the end of the book, which is a really important one, which is an idea that has comes from two very brilliant criminologists, one of whom teaches here in Oxford, named Larry Sherman. Another is an Israeli-American named David Weisberg. And they made this, they made this observation in the 90s, which it took them 15, 20 years to convince their peers was true, which was that when you map criminality in an urban area, what you discover is that, and you discover this in every single city, doesn't matter what city you look at, in almost every city they have ever looked at this, 50% or more of crime happens on 2% or less of the city's blocks. What that says is, with respect to stop and search, yes, use stop and search, but use it very selectively. Use it only in those areas that are those handful of blocks where crime is such a serious problem that the local population will welcome an active police presence. Don't use it in areas where there's no crime. And by the way, most areas have no crime. I had a woman driving around Baltimore, a young criminologist who was part of this movement. Baltimore, one of the most dangerous cities in the West, right? In the news right now because Donald Trump was attacking it. We drove through the worst neighborhoods of Baltimore, particularly West Baltimore, which is a kind of, and every 5 minutes she would stop the car and she would say, look around, do you think there's any crime on this street? And she asked me to predict, and she had the numbers in front of her. And I would always say, oh God, looks terrible. I'm sure there's a huge amount of crime. She goes, no, there's no crime on this street. And then we go 2 blocks over and she would say, on this street, there were 150 police calls last year, right? So her point was 2 blocks away, you don't need to have police stopping and frisking everyone. On this block, you need to have police there all the time, right? And that block was one of maybe 10 blocks in the whole city where crime was really, really entrenched. That's what we're asking of police. The correct answer to this puzzle is to be strategic and cautious and highly targeted in how you use police power, because police power has real consequences, right? If you misuse it, you will destroy the fabric of society.
But do you think national systems like policing can be that sophisticated?
Yes. I mean, it's already starting to happen in major cities, and people are getting these ideas that have come up through these fields of criminology are starting to make a difference in the way policing is practiced in more sophisticated police departments. So, the NYPD in New York, which is famously one of the more sophisticated police departments in the world, has been adopting this policy over the last, with the result that a lot of the outcry over what we call stop and frisk has diminished in recent years. They have really cut back on the use of these tactics in neighborhoods where crime is not endemic, and they're focusing it in places where people want and need that kind of active police presence.
Where does your sort of forensic approach come from? I mean, you were the son of an academic. Is it about the way you grew up? Or is it just who you are?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's hard to say. I had many different sources of education growing up. Obviously, parents. I had a friend.
Because you were born in Britain, weren't you? And then,
I was born in Hampshire. Yeah, my father was teaching at University of Southampton. Then we moved to Canada, and I often think, years ago, I remember writing about this book by a woman named who had a theory that peers matter far more in child development than parents. Parents contribute genes and not much else. Peers contribute the balance. And it was very controversial at the time, but since then, less so. People have now come to. So the question is, who are my peers? I had a friend growing up named Terry, who was my closest kind of companion, intellectually and otherwise, for many, many years, who was a truly extraordinary, he was the most intellectually fearless person I ever met. He pursued his interests regardless of what the world thought, regardless of their immediate value, regardless of the consequences to his, grades or anything else. And he had a profound effect on me. His notion was, if I'm interested in it, I'm going to pursue it. I don't really care about what if my mother thinks I'm neglecting my homework, fine, I don't care. So here's this, I'm exposed to this boy at the age of 11, all the way through on a daily basis till I go to college. And it really left an imprint on me that following your nose is reason enough to read something, and it's okay to drop everything else if you're interested in some obscure topic. You shouldn't worry, in other words, shouldn't spend your time. His lesson to me was, what the world is telling you to do is just not that crucial. If you're 14, you should be doing whatever you want to do that enriches your mind. And that was an incredible, I thank Terry all the time.
And I suppose that's your approach to journalism now. I mean, when you're doing a book, and because your books are about a series of different stories, are these all stories that you've gathered over time and then go, okay, that makes a book? Or, what's the approach? I mean, or do you have an idea and then look for examples?
Well, it's a little bit of both. So this book, for example, began, I read in a book that no one appeared to have read. I don't know why I was reading it. In a memoir of an old CIA guy who was a CIA's Cuba expert. He told a story, this extraordinary story, which is in the book, of someone defected, someone high up in Castro's intelligence apparatus, defects to the West in 1988 and says, I have a story to tell. I would like to meet with the top CIA people interested in Cuba. He sits them down and he says, you have a spy in Cuba by the name of X. That guy works for Cuba. He doesn't work for you. He's a double agent. And he says, you have another person whose name is Y. He doesn't work for you. He works for Cuba. And he went down, he named every single spy the United States had in Cuba and said, actually, they're all double agents. They've been working for Castro from day one. Everything you thought you were doing in Cuba for the last 10 years is a sham. And the story is so incredible. And I sort of tracked down all the people who were involved in it and recreate the story. But what's amazing to it is, so in other words, the most sophisticated intelligence agency in the world was duped 100% by this, relatively impoverished tiny island in the middle of the Caribbean Sea. And was completely unaware of it, right? Completely unaware of it until some random guy came in and said, by the way, they're all, and that notion of, I was interested in this general topic of why are we so bad at making sense of strangers? This is the perfect illustration, because if the CIA has no clue about the loyalty of its spies, no clue, right? An agency that is dedicated to, dependent on the belief that you ought to be able to tell the difference between a liar and a truth teller, right? I mean, the whole thing is hinging on that. If they can't do it, who can do it? And that was so that story, there's a example of a story that gets me started that raises a question that I want to try and answer. And you look for answers in the world of social science. You say, well, what can psychologists who study deception tell us about that puzzle? And the answer is they have a lot to tell us about the puzzle. That's what really the book is about.
And do you come to a conclusion as to how the CIA could avoid being duped in the future?
My conclusion is they probably can't. And they know this. If you speak candidly with people in the spying business, they will tell you there is no way to prevent deception. And now more so than ever. I mean, think of the two biggest spies of the last 10 years. They are, in the United States, they are Chelsea Manning and Ed Snowden. Who were they? They were both extraordinarily low-level people who weren't on anyone's radar screen, who had, Snowden wasn't even an employee of the US government. He was a contractor to an outside agency. Chelsea Manning was someone who they tried to kick out of the army repeatedly. She was and yet these two people managed to literally have done more to damage U.S. intelligence interests than almost anyone else in the post-war era. My point is, it's impossible to police these things. What do you do about that? I don't know. One argument is it's pointless to have spy agencies. You really can't tell if you can't tell who's lying or telling the truth, then you should probably just walk away from the game of spying.
So if anyone thinks Talking to Strangers is a self-help book, you're not going to walk away from it with a set of tips.
Well, it's a certain kind. It's a certain kind of self-help book. It's a self-help book that does not actually tell you how to help yourself. It is, but those are also useful. Those are also useful. Sometimes it's very useful to know what you can't do. So I end up by saying we need to approach strangers with caution and humility. In other words, slow down, and don't pretend that you can know everything about everyone in a short period of time, or even ever. Be content with those parts of a stranger that you can make sense of, and give up on the notion that you can ever have complete understanding. And that conditions everything from the way police encounter people in the streets to the way I have a whole chapter on the role of alcohol in sexual assault and how we have radically underestimated the disruptive power of alcohol in that context. And that, if you want to end the epidemic of sexual assault, particularly on university campuses, right now we seem to think if you just educate young men to be better behaved and respect the rights of women, we'll be fine. I'm sorry, that's nonsense. Because all that learning goes out the window if the man has had 10 vodkas over the last hour and a half, right? What you really need to do is control the intake of 10 vodkas and make it very clear to the young man that if you are so foolish as to so completely disable your better senses by drinking 10 vodkas in an hour and a half, you will be held accountable for your behavior, right? That makes sense to me. And that's the conversation that in many contexts we're not having. We're pretending that something like alcohol does not disrupt our ability to make sense of each other's intentions. But in fact, if teenagers are already idiots when it comes to, social interaction, and they are, right? You and I remember.
Sure.
I see that look on your face.
I have children.
You have children. You know what I'm talking about. Then it is the height of lunacy to introduce an element, severe inebriation, into what is already a bad situation and make it worse.
So are you a prohibitionist?
No,
really.
I'm not a prohibitionist. I understand that there's no way to stop teens from drinking. But if they are going to drink to excess, there had better be adults around to make sure that to limit the bad consequences, A. And B, it will be very useful to explain to teenagers that there's a big difference between having 2 beers over 2 hours and having 5 shots of vodka in 20 minutes.
And does the course of writing your book change your own behavior? I mean, do you talk to strangers differently?
Yes. It has made me, ever since I wrote the book Blink, I have become more and more and more and more convinced of how dangerous interactions can be, or at least how problematic they are. And so I always give the example of, I hire differently now. I try to limit my face-to-face interactions with the people I'm interviewing for jobs.
I've heard you talk about this, and I find it intriguing because I get that you think it's probably better to hire the best person for the job objectively on paper and according to their skills. But a lot of the success of working with somebody is the interpersonal relationship.
Yeah.
Which is to do with you meeting them and getting on with them and liking them.
Well, I will say several things about that. Yes and no. My assistants don't. So part of this is specific to what my assistants do. They're not in the same, I'm not in an office. They're in a coffee shop somewhere in Brooklyn. I'm emailing with them.
So you don't meet them?
I meet them once every 10 days. And whether or not I get on with them is not terribly relevant. I mean, I would like to. It's more pleasant. But in fact, their job does not require them to be nice to me. Their job requires them to do their job. So it confuses matters my worry, and I think this is true of all human beings, my worry is that if I meet them face to face, I will downplay the formal characteristics that are necessary to be good at their job, and I will inappropriately overvalue how well they get along with me, how funny they are, how interesting they are, how well they're dressed, how attractive they are. I could go on and on and on. Do they have a nice smile? All these things don't matter. They don't matter. They matter if you're selling perfume on the ground floor of Harrods. They do not matter if you are Malcolm Gladwell's assistant, right? Or for 90% of the jobs in the world. It does not matter whether you have a nice smile. It matters whether you're honest and hardworking and conscientious and show up in the morning and, take criticism well. These are not things that you can reliably decipher from a 20-minute interview with someone, right? These are things you learn over time, or you learn from talking to the people. The really great job interview is where you never meet the person, which you only talk. If you could have honest conversations with people in their life, which you can't, but let's assume you could, that would be the great job interview, right?
Or if you could both really say what you think and not see each other.
Yeah. I'm just hiring an assistant right now, and I realize if I could have 5 conversations, off the record, anonymous conversations with the former boss, former coworker, ex-boyfriend or girlfriend, mom, and high school English teacher, that would be better, right? Much better.
That takes you back to Blink, which is a while ago.
Yeah.
But what about talking to strangers?
All of us have this, I call it transparency in the book, this expectation that someone's inner feelings are going to be reliably and transparently represented on their face and in their demeanor. And that is just not true.
So have you stopped judging on appearances or on first impressions?
I've tried. I've tried, for example, you're very charming, and I've tried to keep my judgment of your charmingness at bay. And just...
I'm not usually described that way, I have to say, but it's nice of you to say so. I am sort of getting the impression that you are kind of, you carry on doing what you're doing, partly out of curiosity and partly because you're driven to just do it, but also partly because you want to change the way people think. You do want to change the world to some degree.
I do.
Are you embarrassed to say that? Or is it...
Am I embarrassed to say that?
A lot of people are embarrassed to say, I want to change the world.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I can change the world. I would like to. I think I can nibble around the edges with it. But I guess a better way to say it, I believe human beings are capable of being better. And so if you believe that, then you have no choice but to help them get better. So I'm fundamentally not nihilistic in my view of human nature. I am an optimist in the sense that I believe all of us can tomorrow be better people than we were today. Yes.
I like to ask everybody, if you could just change the world, what would you do? How would you change it?
I would, like major wave a magic wand kind of change it. I would take the populations of the 10 wealthiest countries in the world, and I would swap them for, how long did you say, a week, with the populations of the 10 poorest countries in the world. And then I would let everyone go back after a week, and then I would let the world go on in its merry way.
And what do you think that would achieve?
I think it would blow the minds of both parties, particularly those from the wealthiest countries in the world. I think it would radically change their understanding of what it means to come from privilege, what it means not to have privilege, and they would radically change it would destroy their useful and, I think, not useful. It would destroy their pernicious myth that they are somehow responsible for their own success. And I think it would give them a good deal of insight into the suffering of others.
Malcolm Gladwell, thank you very much indeed for sharing your ways to change the world.